We're in San Diego, filming for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive, and I am honored to have Helen Oakley Dance as my guest, author and jazz lover. Thanks so much for being with me.
Jazz producer is what I like best.
Jazz producer.
That's what I think is most important.
Yes.
The music that you have contrived to bring to life, bring out. Don't you think so?
Yeah.
That's what lives.
When you use contrive, how does that work as a producer?
I don't even think of it that way. I mean, you know, I started very early. I think I was the first woman producer, and I was in Chicago before Downbeat was born, really. And so, you know, I was also the first contributor. But I just always looked on it from the start till now as you're just a channel. I don't think of producing it. I think of it being produced through you. And that's the way I think is very important, because that's what is important.
Yeah.
And of course, you can be helpful, but the main thing is that you are a channel, I think.
Do you think a producer can try to put their mark on music too much?
Yes.
Yes.
I think there's not sufficient respect all the time for the musicians. The gift that's there, that you're trying to retain for history.
Yeah.
Don't you?
Yes. Can you recall when you first heard jazz music and were attracted to it?
Well, of course, I know Stanley is going to privately wish to argue about this, but I always insist. I was in Toronto, which was very corny then, not quite so corny now, but, you know, jazz didn't exist, it wasn't an element, and in those days, the family had records sent in batches once a month from the big record store, you see, and so about 12 records would arrive, which everybody had a chance to approve, and only I would catch on to one, which nobody else liked, but of course it was jazz. And I was 8 years old. Stanley wants to argue about that. But to me, I was 8 years old.
Well, he wasn't there, was he?
I was a child. No. You know, it was my first thing.
Yeah.
My first, the first time that I ever said, "This is who I am," and Mother would say, "Well, Helen can have her record," which was always it. And it was Cold Cart Blues by, you see, my memory fails me all the time. Stanley might be able to mutter things in the background, could he?
Yes.
Or,
wasn't the original Dixieland Jazz Band?
oh, no, it was black.
Okay.
It was...
Cold Cart Blues.
It was very, very early. The early blues, the first records that I listened to. Those black records, who was it?
Was it Bessie Smith?
No, it was a band. It was...
Oh, a band.
Yes.
It wasn't even Bechet. It was before that.
King Oliver?
It was back in those days,
okay.
definitely.
Yeah.
And so that was when I was first introduced to jazz. And right away, that was it. And that's all I wanted to know about and hear. And I didn't know what the instruments were or what I was listening to, but I always knew what I was listening to. And the years later, I said, "Oh, that's Benny Goodman." You know, and then I'd say, "Oh, and that's Bonnie Berrigan." I knew all those instruments, but I didn't know what they were.
Right.
I wasn't a trained musician. But happily, I think I might say, like many musicians, I did have ears. And that's what's important, isn't
Right.
it?
And eventually you were able to tell one player from another. And,
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And one instrument from another was very important,
Right,
isn't it?
right. So the music in Toronto, when you were growing up, was the typical pop music of the time.
To me, there wasn't any.
There wasn't any. Okay.
Luigi Romanelli was like the Lombardos.
Oh,
you see.
okay.
And then, but I had an older brother that Duke was also very fond of, and he and I would listen and go to things together, and so that way, he and his friends that were going on to college they'd train me, you know, and they were beginning to play something, and they'd say, well, that's clarinet, you know, and that's so, and I would tell them, that's what's good.
And when was the first time you got to see and hear jazz, to see something live?
Well, that was, you must stop me, you know, if you want me to move from period to period, but because I would not do the things, my sister and I were close in age, and we were debutantes in Toronto, and that was Toronto for you. And she went on from there and had quite a wonderful career. And I said, no, I'm going to the States. And my family didn't think much of that. And so my mother said, all right, I'll take you to Detroit, and I'll see that you're set up, you know, properly. Have a piano and somebody to watch over you and so on, you know. Mm-hmm. So I was in Detroit. So I said, okay, the Greystone Ballroom for me. And it was Fletcher, Henderson.
Oh.
And, you know, it was way back in 33, wouldn't it be? Something like that. Stanley will correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, so for my long dream, for our Deb party, I had wanted to have McKinney's Cotton Pickers because of Fats, who sang Baby Won't You Please Come Home, and those wonderful things. And Fats died on the way up to Toronto. And so we never did get them. But Fletcher Henderson was very good substitute as far as I was concerned, because I thought, at last, Hawk. And so I arrived all alone, you know, at the Greystone Ballroom in the black section of Detroit, and all big eyes, and making my way to the front of the bandstand, which is where I remained for the rest of my career. And there was Fletcher's band, and where was Hawk?
Oh.
He'd just gone to England.
Oh, no.
And it was Lester.
Oh, well.
Well, but you see, I didn't have enough ears, because I was listening for Hawk. And like the rest of the band, we all thought that Lester wasn't making it, including Miss Lee, Fletcher's wife, who took him, you know, Lester always yells, took him down in the basement and said, now, listen to this, and this is how you're supposed to see her. And you know enough to know what Braz was like. And he was such a gentle soul. He wouldn't say to you, you're all wrong, or you aren't with it, or anything.
Right.
But he soon quit the band. He wasn't fired. They didn't think he was doing the great job, because he didn't take Hawk's place.
Yeah.
But Lester knew, and he went back to Basie.
Yeah.
He went back to Kansas City. So, well, that was my first experience.
Yeah.
And after that, I quickly thought, Detroit's nowhere, and I must go to Chicago. And I was very lucky there, because I don't know if you know or not, did you ever hear of a man called Squirrel Ashcroft?
Yes.
Well, you know, Stanley and I have our archives together at Yale, and I insisted on having a mini archives on Squirrel, because although Stanley and I are supposed to be entirely black, we're not entirely black. And in my day in Chicago, there was Davy Tough, there was Bud, there was, well, I didn't know Teschmacher, but I mean, it was a wonderful school.
Jimmy McPartland was in there.
Yeah, It was a wonderful school. I mean, I still get things like that, and Stanley is sort of, his face doesn't light up like mine does, but that was my background for white jazz. And I consider it was, I don't know where there were backgrounds for white jazz. The people that liked Bix, they were, you know, and Squirrel Ashcroft was a very close friend of Bix's. And, you know, the bass saxophone player, Rollini's and people, that was the white thing coming up. And it really was very important because those were white guys who were moved. And they were in Chicago, and they'd go down on the south side all the time, you see, and they'd go to the Lisa and so on. And of course, then they were listening to Louis and who did Louis
King
work for?
Oliver.
And King Oliver and everything in those days. So it was a wonderful spot for me. You know, I was able to get both sides.
Yes, right in the middle of it.
It was terrific. And then, so that's when I started recording, which I don't know whether you're interested in or not.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about Chicago, and so this is early 30s, mid 30s?
Mid.
Okay.
I left Chicago in '36.
All right.
And probably I started with Duke in Detroit at the Fox Theater.
Okay.
And I was 18 from Toronto. And of course, and Duke was Duke. And I was darned if I wasn't going to go backstage. I didn't know what backstage was all about, but I was going to go. So I did. And you know, Duke had a marvelous sense of humor and had a marvelous feeling for life or anything that would be fun, interesting. And so when this gal appeared, you know, and sent up her, I sent him a letter on English notepaper. Stanley and I had both, separately, without knowing one another, we'd both heard those wonderful concerts in London. And, you know, so I sent a letter supposedly signed by Spike Hughes, who was the big critic, saying, you know, that this gal has probably got something worth to offer you, you know, if you'll receive her. And of course, this just played into Duke's hands. He had me ushered up. Mill was his girl from a long time. So I went to the dressing room, and Duke received me in the most marvelous fashion, and of course was honored because I'd come. And I had the brass to tell him what I thought was the best in his work and how I didn't really appreciate Barney Bigard. And of course he loves Barney. And I was, because I liked the other type, I liked the New Orleans more than Barney. Barney was typical New Orleans, but anyway, so he listened to me with the greatest kindness and said, would you honor us by coming and having afternoon tea one day this week? And I said, yes, I would be delighted. They had afternoon tea, and I saw my letter up on the mirror, and I knew it shouldn't be there. Why was my letter on the mirror with all the fantasy? Why was mine up there? And I looked at it, we looked at each other, and I said, I probably shouldn't have forged it, should I? And he said, oh, I'm so pleased you did. So we were friends forever after, you know. That was wonderful. So he took me downstairs and said to the guys, this is family, guys. Lay off. And that was wonderful because I was family, and for the rest of my life, and for as long as he lived, I was family, and that was the greatest thing ever happened to me.
That's a terrific story.
Yeah, it was wonderful, a wonderful thing. So I went to Chicago, and I wanted to record the guys who were jazz, for instance. Had never recorded before. Nobody knew about jazz. Stacy, you know.
Yeah.
And jazz, and George Wettling, and Paul Morris. And so I wanted to record them. They were at the, I don't know the title of the place. It was a famous place, New Orleans spot, where they played. And so I did that. I think it was Brunswick. But actually, the Brunswick studios were kaput after a while because the elevator ran right there. I made a
the
terrible
train.
run. The
Yeah.
train
They had to
made a
stop
terrible run. It was bad on the thing. But they were good records. They still hear. Boyce Brown was I want to tell you something about Boyce afterwards. He was an alto player. You probably never heard of him. But he was the first. He was a white boy, and he was blind, and very soulful. And he played wonderful alto long before you heard about Benny Carter.
Uh-huh.
If you hear those records, you'll see that he had a natural gift, and it was wonderful. He had joined a monastery in the end, and he died. But he was probably the best musician out there, and he was quite wonderful. So eventually I went from there to recording a big band. LaVere Johnson, he called himself Charles LaVere afterwards, pianist. And we did a big band. Jabbo came in, was in the band, and of course Zudi and all those musicians that I'm talking about, jazz and so on. And it was a pretty good session. Stanley can tell you about it. And it's been reissued time and again.
Let me ask you, you said you wanted to record these people. Well, how do you get from wanting to do it to actually...
I don't really know. I
mean-
just did. I went up to the studios and said, it's about time
And
that you did this.
You paid for it yourself?
No. I sold them a bill of goods, and I was a so-called writer, so I was on the Chicago Herald Tribune, and so I said to them, well, you might as well let me do the social column, because I know all these guys like Squirrel Ashcroft and all these prominent people. And that's how I launched Benny Goodman and the trio, because, and you've heard about Benny, what a funny guy he was. And I was a friend of Freddie Goodman's, who was a trumpet player, Monkey. You know, he was a wonderful musician, and he didn't really have a lip, which was very unfortunate. He had all the talent, and he knew everything, but he couldn't really cut it as a trumpet player. But anyway, we were great friends, and so I said to him, well, Benny's coming, and I said to Stanley the other day, I wrote one fan letter in my life, and that was to Benny, and I recently wrote another one to Sir Alec Guinness. Did you read My Name Escapes Me?
No.
His book? Well, you should.
Okay.
You'll love it. And so anyway, I'd never written a thing, and Benny had never had one. So when he came, he was interested, and I said to the people at the Urban Room at the Chicago, I forgot the name of the hotel. But anyway, I said to them, well, now listen, Benny Goodman's coming, and he's flopped all the way across the nation till he got to the Palomar in L.A. And there they'd heard him, because they heard the late broadcasts, the Let's Dance things. And I said, it's terribly important that when he gets to Chicago, he's got to make a success, otherwise I'll think that's the only thing he had. So I got Squirrel Ashcroft and all these, and we formed the Chicago Rhythm Club. I said, all right, now we got to get ready for Goodman to come, and we got to make a success of it. And we'll have concerts, because in England, they'd introduced concerts.
Oh,
that
jazz
was a
concerts.
concert that Stanley and I had heard. Such a thing was unknown in the U.S., you know. And so I went up to talk to Benny, and he had a very hard head, you know, and only money talked with Benny. And I said, so he listened, you know, and he pulled a long face, and I said, we're going to put on a concert on Sunday with you. And he's thinking, you know, what's the money? And I said, it's a benefit for the union. And the union has agreed. And so, well, he couldn't really argue about that, you know, so it was all set. And so what we did was we gave a concert with the band. All these Debbies were out in the street selling all the tickets, and it was absolutely sold out. And of course, and Time magazine put it on the cover. This was a concert of jazz, you see,
Wow.
and these people. And so the follow-up on that was important, because I said to Benny, want Teddy? And he said, who's going to do it? And I said, we'll pay the fare to bring him. And we got in touch with Teddy and his wife, Irene Wilson, you know, who wrote Some Other Spring and those things. She was a wonderful pianist, a woman pianist in Chicago in the early days. And so we brought Teddy, and so we said, well, what we'll do, Irving Coughlin was in charge of the house, and I said, well, what we'll do is, there's no dancing, it's a concert, there's no dance floor.
Yeah.
So we'll clear a little bit of the floor, and we'll bring Gene Krupa and Benny and Teddy down and the piano. And we'll put on the trio. And that was the first time that interracial anything was ever given in public. And it was the Benny Goodman Trio. And so from there on, of course, Teddy stayed with the band. It all happened. So that was good.
That is, I didn't know that had
Well, a
happened
lot
like
of
that.
people, you know,
Yeah.
John Hammond used to say that he did it.
Right, right.
And we were good friends, but, you know.
Now, Teddy Wilson was a name in
did they-
Chicago and New York.
Well, he wasn't a name in Chicago, really. He was there. And Irene, who was a name, she helped him.
Okay.
Earl was his idol and everything, but he ended up in New York. And I think he was in, I've forgotten the band he was in, but anyway, Benny Carter had already said, you know, watch it, you know, because this boy could really play. And so he really didn't have a name at that point. His name began with that trio.
How much, did they have any rehearsal time before this happened?
No.
Just,
You never really used to have. And
Yeah.
the other thing I wanted to tell you about that series was, the next thing was Duke. See, by then I was practically traveling with the Ellington Band every now and then. When I wasn't there for the stage thing, I was fined if I was late for the stage. So I belonged, you see. And so Duke was the next thing, and that, of course, was wonderful. That's when he first played Reminiscing in Tempo. Shall I tell a naughty story about John?
Mr. Hammond?
Yes, Mr. Hammond.
I think we could.
Well, it was not really naughty. We'd become friends by that time. But John, you know, prided himself on everything and was critical of Duke quite often. So then, and he had an ugly word or so to say about Reminiscing in Tempo, which Duke had written because his mother had died.
Yeah.
And he was very serious at that time. And then John came out and heard the band and said, "What is that wonderful number?" So we said, "John, we're not going to let you forget that one." And after that, it was Fletcher Henderson who was playing in Earl's spot, you know. And so Fletcher came, and he had Roy and Chu in the band. And that was
Roy
wonderful.
Eldridge and Chu Berry.
And that was wonderful.
Yeah.
So that really was how I ended up my Chicago thing. But it was Duke who spoke up, and he said to Irving Mills, "Now then, you got to bring this girl into New York." Why? Well, I'm just telling you, because, you know, Duke, that's how Duke operated. He always spotted, even if you had a minimum amount of talent, he'd find it for you.
And make
so-
the most of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fact that Duke said that was enough, you know. And so Irving Mills, I was brought into a Mills office. And that was the other half of my career because, as Stanley, I think, told you, Mills started these two record companies. Master Records was the top label and Variety was the second. And I was the producer. I used to sit at this long table with about 20 accountants and people, you know, and then they said to me, you know, what have you to say? And I said, and so somebody said, she did those Goodman things, and she did this, and she did that, you see. So I said, well, we ought to make the small band records. And I knew Duke would agree, you see, because Duke, amongst other things, he had a very good head for what could make a bit of money, because he needed to. How was he going to keep
the
going
band together
if he didn't? And so, of course, you know, that was a very good idea, because for 2 years, well, it went on after I left them, we just made the small bands. You know the small bands, don't you?
Sure.
Well, you know, so it was Cootie and Johnny that I wanted, of course. And so Duke started off with Barney and with Lawrence, I think, and yeah, Stanley's saying something. I can't remember. Ray Nance?
Ray Nance.
Rex, of course.
Oh,
yes.
Rex Stewart, okay.
Rex, who really never was able to show who he really was or how. You know, he had a bit of a complex. I think his writing later shows you really who he is. But anyway, he was a wonderful musician. I mean, the Fletcher, Henderson, people knew that. He didn't show up, to my mind, for what he really was. With Duke established a personality for him and made him stay in it,
yeah.
you know. Man with a horn, boy with a horn, and those things. But anyway, that was great, great fun. For a couple of years we made those small. No, we never rehearsed. We never did anything.
Was there competition among Duke's men to want to be a part of these records?
No. I mean, Duke's Men, you know, is another story, as I know you must know. It was a complicated family with all the family stories that are in families. There were ins and outs, and they changed sometimes and so on. No, nobody ever, you never saw the face of people, you know. As you know, Johnny Hodges had a complete immovable face, no matter what gorgeous thing he was playing. And so they had little things. I mean, Johnny and Barney they sat next to one another. You know, they had a little somethings at times. But mostly everything, it was the Ellington Band. And as a family, nobody else knew. You know, it was family affairs. And they quietly carried on their family affairs. It was very, very interesting.
Yeah. What was a good number of records to sell at that time?
That they sold?
Yeah.
That they sold. Well, rockin' and rhythm, well, let's say better what were the big things in the stage shows. Because, you know, the stage shows, the scrim would come on and the medley would come on. You couldn't help it. It had to be, you know, because that's what the public knew. So, you know, you had Sophisticated Lady and you had all those things. And when you get rid of the medley, then you could see what Ellington was going to give you. You know, he changed that quite a bit. And of course, then he would have to have a vocalist. But of course, he had Ivy then. And he loved Ivy. Ivy, to me, was not the singer that Billy was, or one or two people, but she was a stylist, and she could fit right in there, the way what Duke wanted, you know, and she'd do those things, and Rex would play those things in the background, you know, rug cutter and those things. And well, no, Sonny did those funny things with Ivy, but Rex too on the horn. And so I don't know whether I've answered your question properly.
Well, I was thinking you had mentioned sitting at a long table with the accountants.
Yes.
And if you released a series of records, did they then, you know, months later, say to you, look, those particular records are not selling well, or they are selling well? Did you have to justify
well, they didn't
to
have
them,
to tell me, you know. I knew what was happening.
A number of what's the number of records at that time which would have meant
well, you
a
see,
good
the
release?
two labels, Duke's things were really, the band was on the master label. So then they had to make the money. They had to do Sophisticated Lady and all the things that would make the money. And they did. And my things, I was much better off because my label was the 35-cent label, and it was the jazz label. And of course, I think really those small band records have proven themselves over the years because they are still thought wonderful by the musicians. Mostly all the musicians today will recognize what was offered there. And of course, it was marvelous because they were not rehearsed. And there was Duke on the piano. I mean, the music came out of them. You know, Duke would sit there on the piano and he'd just hammer away a minute or two, and he'd look over and say, "Rab, you know, come up with something meaning. Rabbit."
Rabbit, okay.
And so Johnny would not look pleased, of course, because if he looked pleased, he wouldn't be able to ask for money afterwards, you see. So it was always going to be difficult. And so then he'd play 8 bars maybe, not more, not 16, 8. And Cootie, they were good friends, you know, so Cootie, as Duke would say, "Coot," and Cootie would oblige with 8 bars. There you had your number right there. So then Duke would just play the chords for the middle, for the release, you know, which were wonderful. They made the number, and then they came back, and there was your number. And of course, you only had the 3 minutes, and it depended on the tempo, whether you had 2 choruses or what. And then Irving would be there in the control room, making trouble. I very often was in the control room, but most of the time I'd be in there with the band. They'd say, you know, if she's smiling, that's it, it's okay. And so then he'd bring these flugy-woogys, you know, these poor little dears, these little blonde things that would sing the pretty songs, which Irving would insist were being played because he was a songplugger. Irving made his way as a songplugger, you know. So that made it a little difficult, you know. But and then I did have one story that has been quoted, because it bothered me, this business of these time wasted on these vocal numbers, you know, and it was all precious time. And so after the date was over, you know, I said to Johnny and Cootie, I guess, and Harry, you know, and I said, "Well, I'm sorry, guys, you know, you couldn't help." And Johnny said, "I thought she was very cute." So I said, "How can you win?" So anyway, that's that period.
Oh, that's a marvelous story. And when Ellington would just sit and play those chords, do you think that was fairly spontaneous?
Oh, absolutely spontaneous. I mean, it was the Duke. All he had to do makes me think of Monk when I was going to say to you, "Aren't you lucky to be called Monk?" I mean, you know, you make sounds and that talks, like it did with Monk, too. You know, and so those sounds were Duke's inspiration. Almost any sound. Stanley traveled with him in, I don't know about the Far East, but a great deal. And there he heard sounds. Then his music came out of that.
Yes. And he talked about that in the books I've read, in it, that he didn't try to mimic them specifically, but it was more of an, I don't know,
No, he was inspired.
Ambiance, or
inspired by it. So was Monk. Same thing. And anyway, after that, I mean, there was a period there, 3 years perhaps, that completed my career, because then I went into the Office of Strategic Services, which was America's spy unit, you know, and we went abroad.
Yeah.
And we dropped bodies in France and things like that, you know. So that followed, and that ended that period of mine. But at that time, it was nice because I worked with Mildred and Red a certain amount, but various people. The Crosby band, I'm the one that said to to Gil Rodin, form a small band out of those guys, those wonderful guys, Eddie Miller and those guys, and because Ray was a good drummer and so on. And they did. And I had a card from Bob Haggart this Christmas, which quoted a little paragraph saying, bring on the bring on the Bobcats, and we'll go into the Black Hawk and so on. You know, it made me laugh because. But anyway, I mostly I left Mills because I didn't have a free enough hand, and of course my things weren't making a lot of money. But Johnny's Jeeps Blues and those things, they were heard from one end of Harlem to the other end, jukeboxes on every block. And of course it was hugely popular, you know. The small bands were very popular. And there was one guy left that had tremendous amount of talent and was never really made it, and that was Chick Webb. And he was a wonderful little guy with a tremendous ears. The guys in the band used to say, no matter who hit note, what note, and he couldn't read, but he always looked around, gave the guy, glared at the guy. Am I running out of time?
No, no. That's
Well,
great.
anyway, so that office hired me to make a hit with Chick, who'd had a wonderful band all those years. And like Cootie and Johnny lived in an apartment with Chick. They were all hungry. And they had offers, but they wouldn't leave Chick. Johnny was supposed to be Chick's cousin, which he wasn't. But they were very close. And so Chick had this wonderful background, and it never happened. And you see, he had TB.
Yeah.
He had TB. People didn't know, but they knew he wasn't well. And he was the bravest little guy and the most wonderful character you could possibly imagine. A big talker and a big time guy. And you'd go uptown into the corner of 137th and 7th Avenue or wherever, and you'd see a group of musicians, a circle of musicians, spellbound. You wondered why, because you couldn't see who was in the middle. It was Chick.
Oh.
And he'd get people by their lapel and tell them things. I mean, everybody loved him.
Wow.
He was a wonderful, and Stanley and I had a very marvelous experience because when Stanley came over, we went up, you know, and he called me Oakley, Chick. Say, Oakley, this kid, I don't know if Stanley blamed me for this story, but he told me, Oakley, this kid's in love with you. With you. And of course, naturally, Stanley didn't expect to be taken seriously, and he wasn't. But anyway, we had fun. And so I built Chick up. But I was in a horrible office, you know,
Yeah.
money guys who didn't care.
Right.
And so I wanted to make a name for them. And of course, Benny I knew well. So I said to them, we'll put on a battle of swing. In England, they had battles of swing, and we'll put one on. We've never had one in America. So put on a battle of swing, and so I told Benny, you know, and so Benny was not going to care, and he was a decent guy, Benny, basically. And I mean, he was a musician, and he loved music, so he respected it. And so he played the concert, the famous concert, and from there we all went up to the Savoy Ballroom, and the two bands battled. And the mounted police was out. There were thousands of people all over the streets, and you couldn't get in, you know. And it was wonderful. And I didn't want to ruin Chick. And of course, I knew that Gene Krupa just worked Chick anyway. And so so actually it wasn't too horrible an affair, because although Benny was a tremendous success, the Savoy Ballroom belonged to Chick. The place was Chick Webb's place. And then there was Ella.
Yeah.
So Ella came on, and that turned the tide, of course. So it was considered, you know, Okay.
Was it a tie?
I think I wrote it up in downbeat, and I said it was a tie, and I was afraid that the musicians there would down it, but it went over as a tie, you know. And after that, so that went very well, and Bill Chick, and he went into the Paramount Hotel and so on and so on. He was desperately ill all the time, but he used to faint after he played 5 shows at the Paramount a day, and he would faint. He was loss of blood and everything, but he was so game. So after that, you know, we said, what next? And I don't think they were too happy, but Basie came to town. And I'd been listening to Basie, and Basie, they very kindly, Basie and Prez, and they said, you know, this gal is the gal that's writing in downbeat, you know. And Irving Mills said to me, I'll let you give a party. I've got the recordings. He was, ask everybody you want. So I asked everybody I could think of that meant something, you know, that could play. And the New York Rhythm Club came in on it too, Milt Gabler and so on. And the Basie Band came in. They didn't play, we have pictures, Earl played, and I'm not sure that Earl played. I don't know that he was there, but anyway.
He's talking about Earl
Duke.
Warren or Earl
No, Earl
Hines?
Hines.
Okay.
There's only one Earl.
Yeah, all right.
But anyway, it was a great success. It was wonderful. And so I knew that I really fell in love with the Basie Band because that was the band, and the rhythm section, and Lester, and of course the brass section.
Let me ask you something. I got to meet Claude Fiddler Williams, and apparently when Basie first came to New York, Claude was in the guitar chair.
Was he? I
Yes,
don't know.
but it didn't last.
No, it couldn't have lasted. No, especially with Freddie.
Yeah.
He was so wonderful.
That sound of that, I mean, I'm convinced in my own mind that the sound of that acoustic instrument just chomping.
Me too. I still think that. Do you still think that?
Yeah, I mean, it just added that extra bit to the
They
rhythm
added
section.
a bit of something musical. You know, the chords and the strings.
Yeah.
I was thinking just the other day, Stanley was playing something very good, and I thought, what a pity they were so smart as to nix out the guitar, because it was a wonderful rhythm instrument. And of course, the guys used to say, you know, Freddie wouldn't let you, not Joe Jones. He was wonderful, but they used to say, Freddie wouldn't let you budge from the beat. Freddie was immovable from the beat, which was really quite wonderful.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm sure we're running out of time.
No, we're not.
Oh, good.
We have
well, then
more
I'll
time.
just tell you the end of that then, because the end was, I knew I was fighting a losing battle. Well, then I put on the battle bands between Chick and Basie. And you know that there was only one answer there. Although, you know, Chick, he was a battler. And of course, the sound of his drums, there was nothing like it. And that bass, that bomb that started off, the whole Savoy Ballroom used to lift the floor. And so Chick held his own as far as the people were concerned.
Yeah.
But, you know, there was really no comparison. And Billy wasn't with the band. She'd left the band then. But anyway, it was the Basie Band. And so after it was all over, the Webb Band called a meeting and said, she set us up. She exposed us, you know. She set us up. And I didn't care for the band anyway. And it wasn't a wonderful band. And naturally, they didn't like me. And you know, so, and Chick, by that time he was pretty ill and he was frightfully upset. And I said to him, you know, Chick, the office wants to fire me, let them. You know, I've done my job, I've put you where you're supposed to be, and that's what they hired me for. And so that's the end of that.
Yeah.
And it really was. After that, I pretty well lost interest. And the thing was that he went to Baltimore, and it broke my heart because he felt that he wanted me with him.
Uh-huh.
And I should have been with him. And if he didn't have a bad office, I would have been with him, no matter anything. And I used to worry about him, and he was progressively dying.
Yeah.
And so in Baltimore, he went and played another thing on board ship, and we were in white Baltimore, and he was making signals to me to get over and to speak and everything, and I didn't, because I didn't want to get him in trouble either. I mean, I could have also been in trouble, and I didn't want to get him in trouble, so I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it broke my heart because he was giving me that eye, that desperate eye, and I didn't.
Uh-huh.
And he went straight into Johns Hopkins and died 5 days later.
Wow.
And that was quite a heartbreak.
Yeah.
So after that, I was approached by the OSS, and I thought, Rupert had died,
Another
that wonderful brother that Duke had loved too.
Yes.
And he died at Dieppe,
Uh-huh.
The invasion of
Yeah.
Dieppe.
Yeah.
And I guess my heart had sort of gone out of things.
Right.
So from my point of view, and probably yours, my career in jazz ended. I did do what I could for T-Bone,
T-Bone.
which was wonderful, but none of it compared with those.
Right. I want to ask you a couple things about those times. Chicago in the 30s, when you first started doing those records there, how was the Depression and Prohibition part of
It was
the whole
funny,
atmosphere?
I always thought to myself that I was there in the worst time, and I never really realized. It's probably because I wasn't there before it. And it was hard. And of course it was hard. I took it for granted that it would be hard. Jess was playing in the subway, which opened at 10 at night and closed at 4 a.m. And nobody cared for him or listened to him or paid any attention. And it was like that then. And all the guys were playing in dance halls, and nobody paid any attention. There was Muggsy. I didn't really know Muggsy. I wish I'd known him better. But there was wonderful music. And I think everybody just took it for granted that things were rough and tough. And it wasn't till I came to New York and who broke the Depression? The great, not Lyndon Johnson, but before him. Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Who became commander-in-chief when I was in the Army.
Right.
And I mean, it began to lighten, you see, because he sensibly started that, whatever he called it,
The
New Deal.
New Deal, thank you.
New Deal. And that helped the guys.
Yeah.
That helped lots of the guys, too. And it introduced a breath of fresh air.
Uh-huh.
And so Chicago was down, although the South Side was always romping, always. Later, Stanley and I think we took Earl there. I know I went with somebody, and it was still the Club de Lisa, and I mean, it was still wild. In the early days, of course, it was Louis and who did Louis? Well,
And King Oliver.
and King Oliver.
those fellas,
And then there
yeah.
was Earl, who was absolutely marvelous. And so that Chicago was a mixture. It was terrific musically, even for the poor white guys who weren't making it.
Uh-huh.
But the Depression was there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other question I had was regarding these Battle of the Bands.
Yeah.
Logistically, like in the Savoy, what would they do? One band would play for half an hour or a set,
A set.
and the people would respond?
Well, the two bandstands were side by side, you
Uh-huh.
see. And it was a huge floor, and it was a mass of human beings. And as I said, the police on mounted police outside trying to keep order because it was a tremendous thing. But Chick did own that audience. The minute he'd go boom, boom, everybody would scream because, you know, he was king. And so they wouldn't move from bandstand to bandstand because there wasn't room. But you'd be listening one say or one the other, you see,
Uh-huh.
and that's how it was. It was wonderful.
Was it totally black audience at that time?
No. The usual audience was totally black, but then all of those downtown that were terribly interested in the music, they'd come up, you see. So the white people were there for a purpose. So, but otherwise it was, and it had one funny function. You know, in the black world, there are levels, just as there are in the bands, and there were sophisticated society groups that met and had their balls. And a certain night of the week, the so-and-so ball would be there. And maybe they'd have their own band there, or and if they didn't, then you had to play waltzes and behave, you know. But that was the Savoy for you.
Oh,
It's sad that it ended. It
What a
was
time,
wonderful.
huh?
Yes, it was a wonderful time.
yeah.
Which was the kitchen mechanics night.
The,
I don't know.
There was one night which was special for domestics.
But you know, I didn't know that. I guess since I couldn't cook, I wasn't up there.
and the Savoy shut down about when? Do you
Well,
remember?
I wasn't there
Yeah.
when it shut down.
Okay.
When I came back, it was gone.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
you met Stanley first in '37, was it?
36 when I
Okay.
was recording, and he came to the sessions. 37. I knew he'd correct me on my dates because I never.
So you had a 10-year romance? Or was
Yes,
it-
really. It was. I do think.
I mean, you've had a lifelong romance. Let me rephrase that.
Well, I must tell a story about my mother because Stanley, very bravely and wonderfully, well, Webb said, "Oakley, that boy's in love with you," and so Stan made a trip over after the war. You see, we'd been writing once a year for 10 years. That's all we knew. But my family, his family, who were lovely, they were terribly good to mine. My brother, who died over there, he was his best man when he was married, and they were great friends. And my sister, who did die later, was a captain in the Canadian Army, and was the first woman to step into Rome after it fell. She was quite a wonderful person. And so I joined the U.S. Army, and my mother said to me, I don't understand you. She said, what about the British Lion? I said, well, there's always the American Eagle. She didn't like it, but the British Lion, you see,
Yes.
if you were in the Canadian Army. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, so when Stanley came over, when she telephoned one night from Toronto and said, well, what's it all about? I mean, what's it going to come to, you know? And that's when I knew I would marry Stanley, because she said to Stanley, what's the story, you know? And Stanley said, well, she only loves me on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I thought, I certainly will marry that man. And And so we went up to Toronto, and then everything was very wonderful, you see. And so
Did you get married on a Tuesday or a Thursday?
did we? I don't know. I can't remember. But he took me to England. It was lovely, you know. And we had our 51st wedding anniversary this year.
Congratulations.
So you see.
That's great. I'm just
Well-
going to, I have a couple more minutes, and then
Oh, well,
we'll
tell
wrap
me.
up. I did want to mention the T-Bone Walker book. I think it must have been a great deal of work.
Well, it was all a pleasure.
Yeah.
T-Bone was another personality like
Yeah.
Chick. And he was a wonderful person. And of course, he was a wonderful guitarist.
Yes.
And a wonderful singer. And Stanley had a friend who sent him records, and we first heard him when we were there.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and of course, I've always loved blues anyway.
Yes.
And so, I said to T-Bone in New York, I said, I'm going to write a book about you. And he never heard of such a thing.
Yeah.
And so his wife, who's still alive, and very nice and very sweet, and I said, well, I'll come out to L.A.
Uh-huh.
And Stanley said, okay.
Yeah.
He didn't think much of it, but he said, okay. And so I went out 3 different times, twice to be with T-Bone and Joe Turner and Eddie Cleanheads.
Eddie Cleanhead.
Yeah, those guys, because they
Right.
were a whole group, and they
Right.
were quite wonderful, as I think you might see from that book.
Yeah.
And the third time, I went out for the memorial concert,
Mm-hmm.
which I helped to organize, and which was
Right.
sad. And I'm still in touch with them always.
Right.
Yes.
You know, it was almost like a novel, and I knew the ending, but you know, I wanted to say to T-Bone, like, don't take that drink, you know, don't, you know, you wanted to. It's such a life, such a blues life, you know.
I'm so glad that you liked it, because Stanley will contradict me, but the fact was that Stanley didn't like it. I hadn't done a book before I'd done writing, you know, and so Stanley helped me. He would criticize is the word, always. Isn't he a critic?
Yes.
And so it was different from anything that he, you know, critiqued. And I knew he didn't think too much of it. And so I wasn't too sure myself. But the people in Louisiana, the press, were very nice, and they loved it. And the reader, she said, I'm writing you his letter because it moved me.
Oh.
The reader said, I never read anything that moved me so much, and I cried both times I read it.
Oh, both times.
And I thought,
yeah.
well, you know, and so I said to Stanley, you see, there is something there that somebody liked, and you evidently liked it, Monk.
I did.
You liked him. He came
Yes,
across,
I liked
didn't
him.
he?
Yeah, and it makes me want to go back and listen to his music some more.
Yes.
You know, especially when you hear the other guitarists talk about him too. You know.
Yeah, he's a wonderful person.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this
well,
has
it
really
was
been
nice to talk with
fascinating.
you. And I
I'm-
think it's wonderful what you're doing this archive.
Yeah.
I was in close touch with Harold Samuels, who's the librarian at Yale,
Uh-huh.
and who was the man that originated, was very impressed with everything Stanley had done, and
Yes.
called Stan and said, what about this? And then what about the photographs?
Yeah.
And then finally, what about the records? And of course, it's a big archive.
Right.
And it was really a big step for us, too, because, you know, it's hard to make a living in this world,
Yes.
in this music world.
Yeah.
And it was a big step, so
Yeah.
I think it was important. So I know about the situation about the archives, and you're doing just the same thing.
Yes, we are.
So I'm very interested.
Yeah. I think our strength in our archive will be the video, the interviews, and some other archives have interviews. They're mostly audio.
Yeah.
I think it's important to see the person.
I do,
And-
too.
and-
You've got that, which Yale doesn't.
Yeah.
They don't
And
have those videos.
as I said to Stanley, we will be collecting and acquiring other material to accompany the archive.
I
and,
have something
interviews.
very interesting that I brought for you to see. Stanley thinks that you will want to see it, so later
Okay.
I'll show it to you. See
Okay.
what you think.
Well, on behalf of Hamilton, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and
Well,
it's
thank
been a
you.
pleasure
It's
all the way
pleasure.
around. It's great to
It's
be here.
always a nice world to talk about,
Yes.
you know. Good.
All right.
Good.